Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to everyone joining us from literally different parts of the globe. Like Clark mentioned, we have an international audience today. My name is Isha. I'll be the moderator for today's session. A big thank you, first of all, for joining this webinar, which is being brought to you by Upside Learning. Some quick housekeeping announcements before we get into the actual discussion for today. All attendees will be on mute by default. If you have any questions or feedback, please type them in the chat window or share them in the Q&A panel. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording would be made available to everyone who is registered in a few days from now. Also, you'll get a survey link right after the session so that you can share your feedback on the session with us. I think we'd really appreciate if you could take some time to share that feedback. And now, before I proceed to introduce our speakers for today, just a little bit about Upside Learning and who we are. Clark, if you could just advance the slide. Perfect, thank you. So Upside Learning is a leading provider of custom learning solutions for enterprises across the globe. We've been into business for more than 19 years now, have worked with 200 plus global clients. We've been bestowed with 120 plus awards so far and still counting. As a business, our focus has always been on enabling L&D folks deliver learning that just doesn't look good, but is actually impactful in terms of the performance and business outcomes aligned to it. So that's a little bit about us. With that, my marketing plug is over. I think it's now time for me to introduce our speakers for today. We have a fabulous speaker duo. So joining us from Pune, India is our founder and CEO, Amit Garg. He comes with, of course, over 19 years of experience in consulting organizations across the world on resolving business challenges through learning interventions. He's an avid reader and keeps sharing his insights and findings regularly with the learning community through his LinkedIn handle. He has a big follower network there. I'll share his LinkedIn handle shortly in case you'd like to connect with him on LinkedIn. And then Amit is being joined by none other than the e-learning maestro himself, Clark Quinn. There he is, smiling all the way from Clark, USA. Yeah, Clark is our chief learning strategist. Most of you may already know him, but he's been involved in the design, development, and evaluation of a wide variety of educational technology for over 40 years. I wasn't even born back then, Clark. Okay. And he's authored multiple books on learning, and most of you may have already read some of those through Upside Learning now. And he also holds the honor of being awarded as eLearning Guild's first Guild Master back in 2012. Heavy introductions for both of you. Now, without any further ado, I'll invite you to take over, Clark.
Thank you, Isha, for that gracious introduction, and welcome everybody. Really honored to have you here. I want to start and I want to ask you, what are scenarios? So here's a hint. When I put a question in the middle of the screen, it's for you. And please pop your answers into the chat. We'll get some practice. You've already had some practice telling us where you're from. Thank you very much for doing that. But what to you are scenarios? What makes them? Okay, contextual situations, sample situations to talk through, a hypothetical situation which a learner might find themselves, situations to test out, stories. This is all wonderful stuff. Very place one might be. Yep. Real life, any situation that engages you. Real life examples with consequence of the decisions. Good point, Ryan. Real-time situations, typical practical situations. I see situations coming up a lot. Short situations to base tests on real situations. Fabulous stuff. All of the above. Yes. And this is indeed what's important. Some of the words you've used, situations, contextual, consequences, are all part of it. So one of the things you said is they're stories, and indeed there are. They are stories about what's happening. And there's two types of stories. There are stories we are told or we read, we consume, And then there are stories we write, and not necessarily in terms of generating them, but in terms of our actions choose the outcomes. And so we can use scenarios, stories to communicate things, but we can also give learners stories they write through their actions. And both of these end up being important for learning. We do want to communicate context and situations for people to understand how things play out in this particular way. And we want learners to apply that knowledge and see the consequences of their actions. This is really important. So they have this structure, this format as a story. Once upon a time, that's a setting. And I'm drawing here upon the work on Story Spine. And of course, I'm drawing a blank on whose work that is. But you may have heard of it. But this is a simplified version for the purposes of writing scenarios. So once upon a time is the initial setting in which the context or situation you've been talking about. But one day, there's a situation, something precipitates a requirement for applying knowledge. And either we're going to observe it in watching a story or consuming a story, or we're going to be faced with taking an action. So in a story we're consuming, somebody makes a decision. In a story we're enacting, we make the decision. And as a result, we see these consequences. And it's really important, it turns out, for the purposes of learning, to set a context. It turns out research tells us that contextualized performance leads to better retention and transfer. That means we retain it better over time until it's needed, and we transfer it more appropriately, particularly across the context, as we'll talk about a bit later. So we need that context. We need to precipitate the decision, and it's really important what decision we put in here. For it to transfer best, it should be the decision in the learning experience that they'll have to also perform outside the learning experience. And then as a result, we want them to see the consequences. Eventually, we do want the didactic feedback about why or why not that was a good choice, but it's best to show the learners the consequences of these choices as well, because that's what's going to happen in the world. That will give them clues about was it a good choice or a bad choice if we have consequences of good choices and bad choices in the learning experience. This maps to a structure I've used to communicate the necessary elements of a good practice experience. There's a story setting and a situation that precipitates a requirement for a decision. And then there's the correct answer and the consequences of that, and the wrong answers and the consequences of that. As a slight side note, how many of you have ever seen, in your professional experience, a question or multiple choice question type of situation where the alternatives to the right answer were so silly or obvious that you really didn't need to learn anything to get that right? How many times have you seen that? Because when I ask this question of audiences and settings, everybody raises their hands. Look at this. Way too many. Often see that happens many times. Absolutely. And always, oops, that's even worse. Many times it's so contrived. And I ask you, why would we do that? Let me tell you, there is no meaningful learning that comes from that. The point I'm trying to make is that the alternatives to the right answer, the wrong answer should not be arbitrary or silly. They should respect ways learners typically go wrong. And if they don't typically go wrong in doing this, there's little reason to be having learning about it. It's for the situations that they're going to get wrong. If we don't have any learning interventions, that we create learning practice, and then we should make those wrong answers plausible alternatives, unless they really understand what we're trying to have them learn. And we want, because it's good to get it wrong in a learning experience, because we have a chance to remediate that. Wrong answers aren't bad things for learning. They're learning opportunities. But we want to make sure we've identified the reliable ways people go wrong and address those specifically. All right, that was a wee bit of an editorial soapbox. Let me step aside. So story setting, in this case, here we have a situation where this lady has just been offered a promotion and she needs it. The money will help their particular situation. So that's the situation. They're put in a role. They're given a promotion by their boss if they manage this appropriately. But then a situation occurs. She's given a mission, some goal to achieve, and there's a barrier. And she has to make a decision about what to do. Should she just deny the opportunity or explore it a little more? And there are consequences attached to these. And so it's important that we portray that. And this is the critical element. We need the story setting and the situation, but here the choice between alternatives is the important learning practice. We might tell a story about a choices first to communicate as an example so that they see how a model plays out in context before they actually have a chance to make the choice themselves. By the way, there's evidence from the research of John Sweller at the University of New South Wales that giving people examples before they actually have to do practice, particularly for novices, actually leads to better outcomes than just immediately throwing them in the practice. And Amit, you're absolutely right. Appropriate feedback is so important. Consequences first, but then if you need to provide the didactic feedback, but don't provide it until they've sort of closed the experience by seeing the consequences of their choice. So we give them a practice and a chance to see this, but example in a story to see this, but then we give them a chance to do it themselves. And this is really where the most important part of learning happens, is in their need to make a decision. And I literally saw somebody do this who should have known better, said, oh, we'll just give them the questions and then we'll give them the answers. No, if they don't have to commit themselves through making the effort to make a discrimination, a choice, and then getting the feedback about whether that was right or wrong, they haven't really exercised the necessary retrieval practice. So we can have consequences here of your choices. He says she chose to find out more, and he's telling her, oh, we can do this. This happens to be about bribery. But she sees the consequence of her choice here. Now note that before this, it's just a better written multiple choice question. That should be the minimum change you take away. Stop writing knowledge extraction questions. Is it a this or that? What it is? Ask them to use that knowledge in making decisions like they will have to do after the learning experience, and write those as multiple choice questions. But many times these decisions travel in packs. The consequences of one choice may lead to another situation requiring a further decision. And we can do that. So creating that opportunity to go back and see, take your consequence and see if you can do something more becomes an important aspect of this. I see there's a question in the Q&A. The best thing to do if you have questions as we're going along is toss them into the chat, because I try and monitor that, as hopefully you've seen, and we can try and answer them there. If there are technical issues, throw it in the Q&A, and hopefully Isha can address with it. But if it's a content question about what we're talking about, please throw it in the chat, because we have time to slow down and discuss things. So here, she made a question. We still in the same situation. She's seen the consequences of her initial choice. Now she has a further choice. This is a more complex learning experience, and yet it can be a powerful one. As you play through a whole situation, a whole scenario, sometimes they're single decisions, and we may even give practice on the single decisions before we give these more complex ones. But we can go back and lead to new situations requiring more. question from Latha Nehar. How important perspective is in these scenarios? Perspective is important to me. That's part of the context. Any situation has multiple perspectives. What we want is to put the learner in a situation typically where they have to make decisions in the learning experience like they'll have to make outside from the perspective that they will be performing in that real world situation. We want to put them in the perspective. Occasionally, we may find it useful to give an outside perspective to help them understand it from, for instance, a customer's perception. What we perceive as our actions as a performer may be received differently by the recipients of our choices. And it may be important to understand that, for instance, in customer service, seemingly being straightforward and ignoring the emotional side and going straight to the fact may seem appropriate from a solve the problem perspective, but it doesn't address the customer's emotional experience. And most of the advice I've seen about how to deal with customer service says first acknowledge their emotional experience. If it's got them too wound up, wind them down before you go into the problem solving. So it may take understanding that perspective to help, but perspectives are important. Rebecca says, in training with small groups, how do you manage when people get the wrong answer? I've been giving feedback that being told they're wrong is not okay. You shouldn't make it personal. You shouldn't say, so it's a good point, Rebecca, as Eve has commented. The advice I've seen on feedback says, don't make it personal. Don't say that you are a bad person or you've met, by making that bad decision, but do let them know what the right answer is. You can acknowledge that such a choice may seem reasonable. In my book, Millennials, Goldfish, and Other Training Misconceptions, when I was addressing this, I wanted to help understand why it was appealing before we then tracked back and understood what the consequences were of it being right or wrong, and then showing what the research says. Acknowledging, when somebody makes a wrong choice, you can say, first show the consequence, show the real world consequence. But then in the feedback, you can say, it's perfectly understandable that you chose this option if you believe X, but it turns out the real understanding is Y, and that leads to this. Educating is okay. Don't make it personal, but do give them deliberate feedback. And say, you tend to say that they have a better choice. In fact, we developed content a long time ago for mobile learning, and the expert didn't want to say there were right or wrong answers, just that this was a better answer and this was not as good an answer. That's an interesting point. Let's discuss as a group, throwing open discussion. Yes, and these are all great techniques to deal with it when you're dealing with it in a group decision. And if you break people up into groups and have them work on a problem and come back and share and they've got something wrong, just talk about, yes, that might, that seems like a reasonable solution. However, we found X, Y, and Z makes more sense in this case. So thank you for that discussion. I appreciate it. Yes, recording will be available after a few days, Francis says. Isha announced at the beginning. So the next question, if we've understood what scenarios are, why would we be interested in scenarios? Why should we be thinking about stories, both for the ones we tell and the ones we provide the opportunities for learners to create? They're relatable. Yes, indeed, people can understand more about if you choose the right setting, people can go, oh, I recognize that. I can see that that's the situation I would face. Context, yes, Jesse. It puts the learner in the real context. It's simulation puts them in the situation. Attraction and narratives, yes, we do actually, Eve. We are wired to understand stories. Humans have an inherent attraction and narratives, yes. Transferability. Adult learning tends to tell us that learners don't like the standard quiz format. A lot of people like that separate of andragogy and pedagogy. I don't necessarily, because I think it makes it easy to do to school kids what we really shouldn't. The principles that make andragogy actually are just part of human learning. Everybody likes meaningful choices, not rote knowledge recitation. If you do need to do rote knowledge recitation, and we way overdo this as an industry, tarted up drill and kill works great, but most of the time what will make a better solution for your organization and for kids in schools too is not the ability to recite rote information, it's the ability to make better decisions. And that's what scenarios do. Retainability and relatability, a safe place to experiment, improves innovation. What it does is contextualize practice. So our brains are wired to understand story. And being put in context and asked to make decisions, what we also is true of our brains is that when we faced with contextual decisions like we'll be forced to face later, we will transfer better the closer they are to the performance. When you're asking rote knowledge questions, testing that, people are less likely to regenerate that information in context unless they've had to do it in context. So that's why stories work. And our learning science tells us that when we do contextualize practice, we get better retention and transfer, as I've already mentioned. They lead to better outcomes. Yeah, measuring the width of a beaker really tells us a lot about it. That was a bit silly for something I did many years ago. But the point is, science matters. And learning science tells us that contextualized practice is practice. So we'll visit that again slightly a bit later. When to scenario. So, okay, we found that the scenarios are good for contextual practice, and we found out what scenarios are. When should we do scenario then? Marcelo asks, so while you answer that, I'm going to read Marcelo's question here. How important is it the situation are realistic and related to work activities? Really interesting question, Marcelo. I've been, some folks argue you should never use fantastic settings. I don't agree. And fortunately, the research supports me. I went and asked Carl Kopp, who's one of our good translators of research practice, specifically in the games and area. And he said the research shows that when you have FAR transfer requirements, fantastic settings may make it easier to abstract and transfer. So when you do something like negotiation, which may be with vendors and your boss and contracts and a bunch of stuff, there are widely varying contexts. If you're training just as specific to operate this machine, you may not need a fantastic setting because that's a very concrete, tangible. But when you need FAR transfer, there's evidence that fantastic settings can help. So it's important that the settings are realistic to the extent that you need transfer to those specific situations. If you need transfer to more disparate situations, that you can't provide the context for every single one, to support abstraction, you might make it fantastic as part of it. On to the question, when to scenario, every chance we get. When they have to think and act, yes. When they need more than just knowledge, they need to apply it. Spot on, Dorothy. When you're testing more than knowledge, ability to apply. Yeah, exactly. When decision-making competence can be demonstrated after they've got the basic knowledge to succeed. Then Marienbohr talks about the knowledge you need in the complex situations you apply it to. But some recent research, Agarwal, I'm trying to remember her name. Anyways, a researcher recently used to work with McDaniels Roediger, is now at the Berkeley School of Music, but she's studying transfer and found that doing the complex questions lets you solve the complex problems. Doing the basic questions doesn't really help you solve the complex problems. It helps you solve the basic questions. So really, if you need people to solve complex problems, giving them complex practice is really what you need to do. So you make sure they have the basics down, but the way you test that is simpler scenarios, and then gradually you add the complexity. Seems to be the case. Sometimes challenging a learner before they have the knowledge creates motivation to learn. Dorothy, that's an interesting situation. Research does show that challenging a learner before they have the knowledge, in other words, asking them questions we know they don't know the answer to, does lead to better outcomes. But nobody's done the study I'd like to see, because I think that's because it's activating relevant knowledge. I think there are less difficult ways to do that. I don't think asking questions learners know they don't know the answer to is really great for them. I think we can do that in more gentle ways. And the research isn't in there yet. I would love to have the answer to that question. I do think you want to emotionally show them that they do need this and they don't know it now. I think that's an important component, the emotional part of stories, which scenarios actually tap into when they're chosen the right situation. It's the base of a lot of gamification. Yes, Dorothy, and I don't generally like the term gamification because it's too easy to go to points and leaderboards, which actually can be problematic at best. But I do like it when it means tapping into intrinsic motivation, finding out how games really suck you in to stories where you're acting and they provide good tutorials. So there's a lot that happens. Moral of the story comes through, yes. The consequences of the moral of the story is part of a good scenario design. So I want to say scenario design is useful when it matters. You look at training for life-threatening situations, aviation, military, medicine. They use a lot of simulations, a lot of scenarios, because that practice is really important. In fact, in the case of aviation, and probably in medicine and military too, you train for situations you hope you never face. And they do a lot of training. Now, typically we're not involved in such industries, but we do have a requirement to do this. When you need to train electrical engineers on high voltage machines, doing this practically can have damaging consequences. Exactly. In which case look at what they do in aviation. They scaffold, they give you simulators first. They give you classroom instruction and lo-fi simulators, like, Microsoft Flight Simulator didn't start as a game, it started as a flight simulator. But you're still playing with a keyboard and a mouse. And then you go to flight simulators, we're actually using the stick and joystick and controls that a flight has. And then finally you get into these really rigorous simulators where the whole cabin moves and you have everything. And then you finally fly a plane. That scaffolding is really important when life matters, and what scenarios are simulations. In fact, I want to suggest that the best practice is mentored live practice. When you're doing the real task, it matters to you because it's real, and you're having somebody make sure you don't make mistakes. This is all good. This is the best practice you can have. However, there are some barriers. For one, doing the live task, if you make a mistake before the mentor catches it, or it can have consequences. So live practice can be problematic, but for instance, in those situations where if you make a mistake, you die or somebody else dies, right? So similarly, individual mentoring is costly to handle, to generate, to make. So for these two reasons, mentored live performance is a problem, and scenarios are the next best thing. There are a number of ways to do it, and in fact, that's the next question for you. How to scenario? Okay, we found out what they are, we found out why they're important, and when you should do them. How do you do them? How do you scenario? And again, questions in the middle are for you. Pick up the real life situation. You do want to find out what the situations they are in and bake those into what you're designing, or find, it may not be real life. You might exaggerate it a touch. Praveen. For instance, instead of just working on another patient or another deal, you're working on the ambassador's daughter or the daughter of the rebel leader fighting the oppressive regime. Or you're not just doing another business deal, you're doing the deal that if you don't get done, the company goes under. We might exaggerate because the pressure in real life is going to be compelling. We want to ramp up the pressure in the learning situation so that it has some of that same importance. Use creativity, absolutely, Noor. Eve says you may need to call them hypothetical. If people are concerned that it's real, you definitely would want them to know, but typically I think our learners know that they're learning situations. Design the scenario based on the learning outcome you want to achieve. Yes, well, absolutely. You want pilots to be able to navigate through turbulence, so present a scenario challenging their ability to react to turbulence. Absolutely, the scenario should reflect what it is, maybe based on current situations, but suitably disguised where necessary. Yeah, sometimes, particularly experts don't like to tell stories of great losses, and yet that's how you find the mistakes to build into the scenario as the alternative to the right answer. But you may not want to impugn anybody's reputation, so you might mask it so it's not so clearly so-and-so's mistake. Create a choose your own adventure type of activity. Yes. Debrief and move to the next part of the scenario. Absolutely. What we're doing is creating a choice. Identify the purpose of creating the scenario. Yes, Noor, that's one. You made my point better than I did. Here I'm really asking about, what are well, no, I'm not. Make them relevant to the audience so they can relate to them. Absolutely. They should recognize that the situation in the scenario is relevant to what they have to do afterwards. You've made them a promise. You should make them a promise up front at the entrance to the learning experience that you need to know this and you don't know this now, and this situation is going to change it. Then when they face the scenarios, they should recognize that indeed doing this learning experience is relevant to me acquiring that ability. Yeah.
Just a quick one. I think there's a comment, very interesting comment by Marcelo. You may have missed that. It's about psychological and cognitive dimensions of decision making in a scenario. So if you want to scroll up, you'll find that.
Oh, okay. Thank you for catching that, Ahmed. I missed that, and I scroll back and I see, yes, the psychological and cognitive dimensions of decision-making in a scenario should be as similar to, as possible for authentic transfer, but the emotional dimensions may be different. We actually want to, we won't get the same commitment and learning experience as we do in the real experience where it matters unless we ramp it up to make it more important. And fantastic settings can do that. It also, again, well, here's the challenge. In some cases, we can't cover all the circumstances in practice that they will see in the real world. So we can't make them as perfectly accurate. We choose the context so we cover a spread, but we may choose a context that people has the same decision-making requirements, but is in a totally different setting that makes it easier to abstract the underlying principle and transfer it to other situations. So, and there are times when being as authentic is important, when you know exactly the circumstances that they're facing, but other times you may want to generate more robust ability to transfer more than you can cover in the learning experience, in which case, what can we do to facilitate that transfer? That's my argument to that point. Christopher adds empathy for the learner. Absolutely. Let the participants create the scenario, then they have more buy-in. That's wonderful if you can do it, if you're doing it live, if you're creating abstract circumstances, really asynchronous learning where you create it and then they go through it on their own time. You might get participants involved up front. You should try and get their feedback and get expert feedback about what makes good scenarios, and they should refine it and test it. But You may not always allow them to be able to create it on the fly if you're designing asynchronous e-learning. And Eve says, I get help from SMEs for scenarios. Absolutely. They can be really useful. However, they don't always know what they do. And depending on the subject matter expert, academics may know the models, but they may not know the real world problems people encounter. And so I like to triangulate and get information from sort of theory experts, but also from practitioner experts, their supervisors or managers, and say, where do people go wrong despite having this formal model? Latha asks, how much buildup can be used in training during scenarios? How much buildup? It depends. That's the answer always, right? But let me tell you as much as I can what it depends on. If it's really important and you need to get it right before they go out and perform, you probably need a lot of buildup. If it's, they just need, the idea is simple, but the ways that people get it wrong are complex, you might need a lot of scenarios. If the ideas are complex, you might need a fair amount of practice to get it down. So it tends to be based upon how complex is the situation inherently, how much practice chance do they get. If it doesn't happen a lot in the real world, you may need a lot of practice if you can't put the information into the world or otherwise automate it. And how important it is. All of these things will factor into whether you are going to do a lot of practice or rather a little practice and do it. So back to the question of how-to scenario, your analysis should as was mentioned in the chat, you should find specific performance objectives. What do they need to be able to do that they can't do now? For instance, deal with turbulence. And then you make a chance to make decisions in the scenario that has them making the decision that demonstrates the performance. And a good performance objective says, what do they need to do, in what context, to what level? And that's what they should be doing in the practice, although you may have scenarios leading up to that. Then the performance context, what are they performing in? A lot of you were talking about, match and Marcelo in particular was talking about the context that they need to perform in needs to be the story setting for the scenario. Although you can, again, be fanciful if you need. And Dorothy says, I find that sometimes SMEs are too removed from a beginner's experience. It helps to have a newbie. Yes. Sometimes experts don't recall what it was like being a newbie, and they take for granted stuff that they now know that novices don't. So don't always just trust, never, in my opinion, just trust what a SME tells you, validate it by triangulating. And then find the audience interests, not just what context do they have to perform, what are they interested in to choose the role they will play. These are the ways in which we can help design a good scenario so that it works. There's a bunch of other stuff that goes into it. The right level of challenge for the current level of the learner is important. If it's too frustrating for their current level, it's learning doesn't happen there. If it's too easy for them, it's boring, and we do way too much of that. We really want to have the right level of challenge for this is both Csikszentmihalyi's optimal flow to create a good experience, but it's also Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, where learning happens is in that right zone between what their current skill level is and the difficulty you set them. And so we want to be adapting the challenge of the scenarios. We want to make sure, as I've suggested already, we have the right suite of contexts. So if you just practice in the little blue O's, your likelihood of transferring to A is small. But if instead you provide your context for practice in the red X's, your likelihood of transferring to A is much higher. What if you have a mixed level of learners, new supervisors and seasoned supervisors? Rebecca, I like to have some asynchronous learning that levels them up. So your expert supervisors might be able to test out of some of the basic stuff. So because when you have that mixed level, or if you're in a live situation, you might pair up novices with seasoned supervisors so that they can, the experienced supervisors can help the novice supervisors understand the issues from their perspective. But so there's techniques. Well, absolutely, the Yerkes-Dodson performance curve, a little bit of stress actually improves performance, but too much stress interferes with it. And we want to make sure the right level of challenge is there. Yeah. Also spacing. Just doing a whole bunch of practice in one day is, actually you'll do fine on a test at the end of the day, but it'll disappear really quickly afterwards. If you space out the learning over time, you'll do pretty good on the test still, maybe not quite as good, but it'll be there afterwards and reactivating. So the spacing of when you provide scenarios is an important consideration, and breaking up the skills, not just do a whole bunch of A, then a whole bunch of B and a whole bunch of C, but instead, a bunch of A, then a bunch of B, then a bunch of C, mix it up. If you know they're going to have to master A, B, and C, because retrieving in an uncertain environment is closer to the real world, and that leads to better outcomes. So these are just additional factors that we're really not talking about today, but I just want to know that it's not just how you design each scenario, but it's the combination set of scenarios, and the factors around when they see those and what they see make a difference. So what formats do scenarios come in? I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I have a saying, if you get the design right, there are lots of ways to implement it. If you don't get the design right, it doesn't matter how you implement it. So there are lots of different ways. Case studies, absolutely, Praveen. But figure out what the learning experience should be, and then create the solution that uses it. So the traditional way we think of scenarios are the branching scenarios. You have a game problem, an outcome A, the right answer, outcome B, and then if you may have a chance to get back to the right path, or you may not. You may have to deal with other situations. That's the traditional notion of scenarios, the branching scenario. But really, as I've suggested already, even better written multiple choice question can be a game, a scenario, and should be. There are times when we are concerned that we want to see problems play out, but it's important, for instance, for assessment that everybody see the same problem. We can do what we call a linear scenario, where you make the right choice, but if you make the wrong choice, something fixes it. Like a supervisor comes in and goes, "Oh, I saw before you sent out that proposal that you'd made this mistake. I fixed it, but you should know that." And then everybody goes to the next situation. You've sent the proposal. What do you do next? So there are ways to structure these scenarios to meet, the regular reality that different decisions have different consequences, versus a very simple one. If you just using your standard multiple choice tools in your authoring tool, you can do this. Most authoring tools support branching scenarios, but they have an added level of complexity, and we can create linear scenarios as well. Note that branching scenarios can get complex very quickly. Even if we have just two decisions, if we go to several levels, we suddenly have a lot of different situations. And when they do get too complex, there are times when it makes sense to take a step back and say, let's create an underlying engine that deals with this, that calculates it. To me, a simulation is just a model of the world. And it can be in any legal state, and a motivated and self-effective learner can take it to any other legal state. We turn that into a scenario by, we can't bet on motivated, self-effective learners. So we create scenarios where we put the simulation in initial state, ask the learner to take it to a goal state, and they can't get there. We've chosen those such they can't get there until they understand the relationships we want them to understand. You can tune that into a game. But simulation games, which are more complex to develop, calculate the outcomes of all that. They have explicit rules about what the world is. Branching scenarios have implicit rules. They're lower cost to develop quite a bit, and you can do several of them to create much of the same experience of a simulation. Simulations, however, have the ability to have almost infinite replay because you have put a little bit of randomness in some of the variables there, and suddenly you can get infinite replay, lots of practice. That's kind of the deciding factor of when do you go. If it gets so complex or you need lots of plays through, it makes sense to go there. So at this point, I want to hand over to Amit, who's going to talk about some sample scenarios we have done and sum up what we've covered to this date.
Thanks, Clark. Are you able to hear me well? Excellent. Thank you for doing the heavy lifting. Hello, everyone. I just have a couple of scenarios, case studies that I would like to talk you through, and maybe then wrap up the session by summarizing what we have discussed so far. So, Clark, if we can go to the yes. So, this is a program that we did for one of the top 3 airlines in the world. They wanted to do a program on mental health awareness for their employees. And their end goal was really for their people to be knowing the symptoms of people who are suffering from such mental health issues, doing some sort of a self-assessment for themselves, and also taking a decision to reach out to the helplines that they had set up. So what we did here was, captured 5 different personas that we crafted out from different situations and different examples that we received from the company. We also worked on those examples to make them a little more generic. So, no part of identity was to be revealed for those people. And also people don't associate them with a certain profile. So if you had, an example of a pilot suffering, we obviously did not want to depict the person as a pilot. So we kind of mixed it up and make it more generic. So anybody could have those kind of challenges. But yes, the real personas helped us, bringing out their stories, adding a lot of emotion to that. And the focus that we had there was to show how their condition is impacting themselves and their families, and why it was critical for them to reach out for help in time. Gladly, we had a great result from the program. The organization reported 3 times increase in number of people who were reaching out to their helplines. So that was a fantastic achievement. Also, this program got a few awards, a couple of Brandon Hall Awards, a couple of LearnX Awards, also a Learning Excellence Award. Now we can go to the next one. Yeah. This one we've done for one of the leading banks in Asia. They were looking at inculcating some of their values, the corporate culture, that's what they call it, values in their employees through the use of a digital interactive solution. So there were 3 key values that they were really looking at, as they call it, their culture components. One bank, customer first, and results oriented. What we did with them was we again extracted some real situations in which their employees find themselves in, and tried to give options to the learners so that they can see how they can implement or choose, make decisions which are aligned with those values. So this is just one example of the situation that was given. As you can see, there are some previous scenes in this, and we are in the last one of that. The program received good feedback from the organization. We are told that their employees rated it at 4.8 out of 5, which is probably their highest rating, and it's kind of become a benchmark in that organization. And it also received a couple of awards, again, a Brandon Hall and a LearnX. This example, I'm sure some of you have definitely seen. This is one of the, a great example of interactive video scenario-based learning. This was created for the Resuscitation Council in the UK, trying to address a challenge that they were facing, that there were more than 100,000 deaths in a year in UK because when people had some, hard challenges, they would not get immediate proper support from the people who were either their family members or surrounding them, let's say in a subway or anywhere else. So this is a great example of movie-like storytelling and video footage integrated with great decision making and learning, and also a little bit of gamification that's been added to that. If you want to see this, if you haven't seen it, it's available at lifesaver.org.uk. It's available to anyone to see. For some of our samples, if you want to see them, you can of course write to us and we can have a more detailed showcase of those. Just to summarize what we talked about today, we try to define scenarios, big thing about that contextual decision practice, setting them in a certain context, providing a situation in which people are forced or allowed to make decisions, and giving them practice over a period of time with maybe simple decision making to more complex decision making over a period of time as they graduate. Stories become the central piece of scenarios that we discussed today. Again, as Clark talked about, settings, which is more normal day-to-day life, and then situation, which is when things change and you are posed with a challenge or something that you need to decide on. And based on your decisions, you see the consequences and also get feedback. You can have different types of scenarios, mini scenarios, essentially a single question, multiple choice question kind of a scenario, a branching scenario, more complex, linear scenarios when you want everybody to see exactly the same thing, and simulation driven, which is kind of mimicking the world. In our view, scenarios actually turn out to be more cost effective because you end up cutting the flab out. You don't have to do a lot of knowledge part unless you're really dealing with novice workers, for which you should have more support available. But it can be available in a less designed or less cost intensive manner. But if you're focusing more on scenarios, you're actually getting straight to the action items and letting people to make those decisions. Eventually, we believe they work out to be more cost effective. And finally, given what we all talked about today, especially what Clark talked about, these are really non-trivial. While it may look like sometimes it's easy to create some great scenarios, I think it really requires expertise and practice. More practice than expertise. Gradually you can start creating better scenarios as you start going through the experience yourself. But yeah, it is something that is non-trivial, not trivial. All right, so that's all from us. Thank you so much for hanging around. I see there are lots of people still there, and we have good 8 minutes available from our time today for any questions that you may have.
And Isha posted one in the chat from Guru Vendra. At times, the delivery timelines from clients don't do justice to the depth of scenarios being designed. How do you achieve a balance here? And I'll give my brief answer, and then I'll give you a choice. But the part of it is setting appropriate expectations. You have to get people understanding that to achieve, if they don't care about meaningful learning, this isn't useful. But if you want impact, cost-effective impact, you have to set appropriate expectations about what's needed to achieve that and what's involved in scenario design, and that as part of the upfront negotiation, I guess, would be my best explanation. Amit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about, what's the importance of learning itself that the organization is placing. And if you are able to influence at that level, then you can, change that situation. But yeah, I don't think it's easy. We can make small strides. Maybe we can do it. Start with mini scenarios. That could be a little bit of a change from where you are today. But yes, deeper scenarios or more complex scenarios do take time.
And we welcome any other questions in the chat or or if you post them in the Q&A, Isha can translate it for us to the chat.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I'm sorry, Paul, about the hiccups. Hopefully you can watch the recording. And thank you all for your attention during this, listening to us. And we appreciate, also feel free to reach out. Thank you for posting that, Amit.
Thank you for this wonderful session, Clark and Amit. I'm sure the audience is going back with some food for thought today. And a big thank you to our audience for being such a wonderful interactive bunch, as always. I think that's a specialty of our sessions now. We appreciate everybody taking out time to join the session and contributing to it with your experiences and insights. And before you drop out and before we close the session, I'd once again request you to share your feedback on the survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar. You may also reach out to us at elearning@upsidelearning.com in case you would like to share detailed feedback, suggestions, or ask any questions. Maybe we can keep the chat window open for a couple more minutes in case there are any parting comments.
We can hang out for a few minutes and
Maybe a minute more. I think
we can bask in the glow of the chats. Oh, well, thank you, Marcelo. That's an impressive achievement. And it's always nice that people who've read me still want to listen to me as well. So thank you very much. Oh, I see a question in the Q&A. Best ways to do scenarios for a software application. Well, some of those screen capture things can make it such so you have somebody gives you an important task to do with the software, and then you actually have to use the software to accomplish it. But your choices, if you make the wrong choice, it can go different places. And simulations can be better than screen captures and branching if there's more than one way to do it. Or you can try to accomplish that in the design of the branching as well. But it's just a matter of, you still have a goal, you still have a situation precipitating a decision about how to use the software. So it's still a scenario in my mind. Otherwise, there's still...
I think we can close the session now. Thank you once again, everybody. Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Clark. You have a good day, Clark.
You have a good evening, all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.